Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? This ain't murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about not just a hole in the ground. When I joined the Border Patrol back in 1988 and arrived in Laredo, Texas, there were only 3 radio stations, 2 of which played teeny bop music, something I really don't like. Then we had KLAR, which was a country music station, and it was on AM, so you could hear it around town some. I think they only put out about 50 watts because the signal would fade away once you were downtown. They had a DJ. I won't mention her name because, well, she was something else. As her shift would go by, her speech would get harder to understand, like maybe she was consuming something a lot stronger than iced tea. She would announce the wrong songs and get the recording artists' names all confused, but it was better than listening to those other 2 stations. Just to make life a bit more interesting, a lot of our units didn't have good time radios. Most of us carried small portable radios that we could throw up on the dash in order to listen to something while waiting for something to happen. Lots of hours of inactivity. It was the old days. In fact, some of our vehicles didn't have air conditioning. When it's 105 degrees out and you don't have AC, it can be a little much. Well, one day, KLAR switched their format from country to talk radio. Mostly politics during the day and sports in the evening. By this time, we had 2 more stations that were both playing 60s and 70s music, old-time rock and roll. Wow, we were getting high speed. Well, then one day, one of the rock stations switched to Tejano, which was followed soon by the other rock station. So now we had 2 teeny bopper radio stations and 2 nothing but Tejano radio stations. Now I had to listen to politics all day and sports in the evening. Well then, one day, the KLAR surprised everybody when they announced Art Bell was coming on. The first show I listened to was Art interviewing Mel Waters about a weird hole on his land. It was February 21st, 1997. We were working midnight shift. By the time we had muster and received our assignments and got going, it was already about 12:30, so I missed the start of the show. Well, Art would do the news, and then at about 1 o'clock he introduced Mel as his main guest. I was working down south and I had to get out once in a while to open a gate or look at a trail. I stepped out of my vehicle at about 3:55 and I got back in sometime at 4:05. Well, Art was talking about some news items and I listened not knowing that they had started the show over. Originally, Art Bell had been doing a 5-hour show, but he had found it was a bit too much, so he dropped back to 4 hours. The station would replay the first part of the show to fill in the final hour. This was long before XM radio came out and life on the line was bumped up to the next level. Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell, February 21st, 1997. Mel Waters was on talking about a weird opening on his land near Ellensburg, Washington. He'd gotten the land from his ex-wife after their divorce. The land had belonged to another family that had owned it for 40 years. As far as anyone could say, the hole had been there as far back as could be remembered. The locals had been using the hole as a convenient garbage dump for decades. If you drive along the ranches and you come to just about any arroyo out there, you'll find all manners of trash piled up in the arroyos. Used cars, refrigerators, motorcycles, all in a desperate state of condition. One man said he had dropped his dog into the hole just to dispose of the body. Later that week, he saw his dog running around his property. The people began to believe the hole had some kind of paranormal abilities. A stone wall was put up around the hole to keep people from accidentally walking into it at night, and then Mel placed a lid on top just to be sure. A man had been coming to the property for years and dumping old tires into the hole. After several thousand tires had been dumped, the hole was still too deep to see the bottom. Well, Mel became curious one day as to just how deep the hole could be, so he took his fishing pole out to try an idea. He placed a weight on the end of the line and he lowered it into the hole. He also attached a roll of lifesavers to the end to see if there was water at the bottom. If you lower a weight into the water and then you reel it back up, it might dry before it gets back to the top. But if you attach lifesavers to the same weight, you lower it into the water and then bring it back up, you can tell that the lifesavers will have been partially dissolved by the water. He lowered the line until it was all out of the reel, but he never felt the line go slack. Mel reeled the line in, and then he went to town to buy more fishing line. Attaching the bulk line to his fishing pole, he lowered it down until he ran out of line once again. So he bought more line, which also went into the hole. When he'd sent 80,000 feet of fishing line down the hole, he still hadn't hit the bottom. Mel decided this was just too much line to try reeling it back in, so he just left it hanging down the side of the hole. Unable to come up with any kind of a conclusion as to what might be at the bottom of the hole, Mel sent a message to Art Bell just asking what Art might think. Art immediately called Mel back and invited him on the show. It was Friday night going into Saturday morning, and Mel was on for an hour. He described the hole and some of its stranger attributes. He said his dog didn't want to go near it. He added that whenever he was near the hole, he would get a bad feeling, as if something was about to happen. While asking around town, Mel had heard from the locals the hole used to have a ring of standing stones around it, kind of like Stonehenge, only without the top pieces. Then someone told him about seeing what looked like a black beam coming up from the vicinity of the hole and vanishing up into the sky. This weird black beam was seen by several people. The next morning, Mel Waters went back out to his property to work on his experimental plants. He was working with native plants that had some healing properties, trying to come up with possible natural treatments for different diseases. Overhead was a military helicopter. It circled the property a few times. Soon, it was joined by a few more. Mel didn't think anything of this because there was a military base just a short distance away. He left his property and headed home for the night. See, he didn't stay on the property because there was no electricity, there was no water. It was just a piece of land out in the middle of nowhere. The next day, Mel drove out to his property, only to find a military roadblock. The soldier told him that a plane had crashed and they were not allowing anyone into the area. Mel told him it was his property and he had a right to check on his plants. The soldier in charge told Mel he'd better leave, or it was very probable they would find a drug lab on his property and Mel would wind up in jail. Well, Mel took the hint and left. He then called Art Bell and told him what was going on, and Mel was back on the air that night. The people were allowed to call in and ask questions, and so naturally a few took the opportunity to call Mel a liar. Mel just took this in stride. Art hung up on a few, but if you listened to Art Bell enough, you knew he hung up on a lot of people. Don't mess with Art Bell. He wouldn't allow it. Mel said he'd been he had been contacted by a realtor that said there was a very generous offer for his land, even though it wasn't for sale at the time. Well, most folks said that he should get a lawyer and demand the government return his property. Art figured if Mel did try this, he'd wind up being arrested on trumped-up charges. It makes me wonder how many people have been arrested on charges like drug possession or theft right after they came out with some story that the government didn't want talked about. Other callers said he should get a gun and confront the soldiers, keeping him off his own land. That would probably be the last thing he'd ever do. Mel Waters said he wanted to move to Australia to try growing his experimental plants down under. The government gave him a chunk of change, as in over $1 million a year, in order to lease his land, and Mel moved to the other side of the planet. After Mel Waters had been on the show twice, Art Bell was flooded by emails from folks wanting to know more about this bottomless pit. There were a few naysayers, of course, but most people were fascinated by the whole thing. Art said he received over 1,000 emails. Now, this was back when you didn't get 500,000 emails in your inbox every day from people wanting to sell you things that you didn't want to buy. Well, in Australia, Mel's ex-wife filed a lawsuit against him for violating his contract on the property. As she said, there was a septic system put in, a bunch of underground pipes had been laid, and the land was being crisscrossed with paved roads, all in violation of their agreement from the divorce. Mel came back to the United States since the plants he was trying to grow just didn't work out in Australia. He contacted Art Bell and arranged to be on the show once more. Art announced the return of Mel Waters to the show, and the night of the show, Mel was missing. He never called in. Mel Waters had been helping his nephew move. The truck they rented had to be returned, so Mel drove it into town, and then he was going to take the bus back to his nephew's home. While he was on the bus, a fight broke out, and the authorities showed up. Mel was questioned about the fight, and he was cleared of any wrongdoing. He was offered a ride back to his home, and then he woke up 12 days later in San Francisco with no money, no wallet, nothing. He had to call his nephew Collect and ask him to buy a bus ticket. Once back home, he was able to once more get a hold of Art Bell. Art said he felt as if he might be responsible for all the bad things going on in Mel's life. Well, it turned out that Mel's ex-wife had cut a deal with the government to undercut him so she could lease the land to them instead. Red Elk, an Indian medicine man, said he'd been to Mel's Hole a few times, that's what it's called, a few times, and found it was now a secret government base filled with what he thought were aliens. Later on, when Red Elk tried to go back for another look, he couldn't find the hole, as if it had been disguised or covered up. During one of Mel's shows, a caller was on that said he had heard about the bottomless hole back in 1990 while he was in college. The people had been talking about this anomaly for years. Today, you can find a few websites that say this was all just a made-up story. Some folks just don't want to think there's anything out there out of the ordinary. Then there's a possibility that the government stepped in and tried to make the story go away. Who can really say what is going on around us? There are some folks out there who became angry after Art quit his show again. Well, Art was that way. He had first quit Coast to Coast after his son became very sick. He couldn't stay away and he came back out of retirement to run the show again. And then Art retired again after his wife died. Art moved to the Philippines where he remarried, and the next thing we know, he was back on the air again. And then he retired again. Then Art was back with Dark Matter. I was on his show one night to talk about my weird run-in with a bunch of Satanists. This was long before I had my own show. Well, once again, Art quit his new show, Dark Matter, when he was running into problems with the folks at XM Radio. Then, not being able to stay away, he started a new show called Midnight in the Desert. When somebody shot at his house, I think it was probably Art's new wife, who insisted he drop the whole talk on the radio thing once and for all. Art Bell died April 13th, 2018. I was at the Edinburgh UFO conference when I found out. For those folks that got mad because he would quit and then come back only to quit once more, just remember, Art was the first one to create a late-night show dealing with all things paranormal. His shows were almost always interesting, and they kept us awake on midnights. Just about everybody I knew in the Border Patrol and the police department listened to his show. When Arturo Castro convinced me to do a podcast, he said somebody should try to do a show like Art Bell used to do. I did my first show on UFOs because, well, that was how Art had started. I don't pretend to be Art Bell, and I doubt I will ever be as incredibly informative as he ever was, but I'll try. Amazing Stories, Thanksgiving Greedy, was aired November 24th, 1986. I saw this show, but I didn't know anything about Mel's Hole at the time. The plot went that a mean man finds a bottomless hole on his desert property. He concludes that some kind of a being who trades gold for things lives down there. His stepdaughter realizes that the hole people want food, not objects, but the man won't listen. Calvin, who's played by David Carradine, is a nasty guy living in the desert with his stepdaughter, played by Kyra Sedgwick. He treats her very poorly, and he berates her, yet she seems blissfully happy despite all of this. Kind of like she was missing a few cards from her deck. One day something really weird happens with the well, and Calvin is trying to dig. It turns out to be a much deeper hole, and there is something living down there. When he drops a flashlight down there, whoever or whatever is down there shows their gratitude by tying a small bundle to his rope. When he opens it, he finds it's full of gold. Now the greedy Calvin is going to the store to buy lots of flashlights to send down into the hole. During his absence, the stepdaughter sends down a dictionary and some ham. I know it sounds weird, but hey, this is a TV show. This time they include a note written in English explaining that their scholars have deciphered their language and they are thanking them for the ham and they would like some more food. They also include some very expensive jewelry. So, next she sends down some chicken. Calvin refuses to listen to his stepdaughter, and he decides he's going down into the hole to get as much gold and jewelry as he can. He has his stepdaughter lower him into the hole on a hoist. When she pulls the rope back up, there's a note thanking her for the food, and they send her a load of gold and jewelry as a reward. Apparently Calvin tastes like chicken. Castles are designed and built to keep people out. The people would construct high walls with places for soldiers to stand in order to repel attacking armies. The location was usually picked for a strategic reason. You wanted to have a view of the surrounding countryside so you could see danger as it approached. You wanted a water source so you could survive a siege. The castles were built along trade routes or centers of commerce. In the Czech Republic, they have a lot of castles that all follow this formula. And then there's the Huska Castle. It sits out in the middle of nowhere with absolutely no strategic value and no real reason for it to be there. The story goes, back around 1250, the Duke in charge of the region was told of a huge hole that went so far down into the ground no one could see the bottom, even after dropping lit torches into the pit. The locals told stories of bizarre winged creatures that would fly out from the opening late at night, terrorizing people. The Duke believed himself to be far more intelligent than the locals, and so he decided he was going to investigate the hole and prove that the locals were just being foolish. The Duke traveled to the pit, bringing 3 condemned prisoners to use as his investigators. The men had been told any one of them that would go down into the bottom of the pit and then return would be granted their freedom. A rope was tied around the first voluntold, and he was lowered down into what seemed to be a bottomless pit. They had to use all the rope they could find. After a long descent, the sound of screaming could be heard coming from the first prisoner. The soldiers hauled him back up to find out what he had seen. As the prisoner was lifted from the hole, the person that came out looked to have aged decades. He'd gone down as a young man, and he came out very old. The prisoner kept screaming and trying to fight. The Duke had the guy committed to an insane asylum where he died a short time later. This odd turn of events started the Duke to thinking maybe he didn't really know what was going on and it was time to talk to the king. There were stories coming from the villagers about creatures that were half man, half animal seen coming from the pit. People reported winged demons, creatures flying out in and flying in and out of the hole. People reported people living near the pit were afraid to be outside after sundown. During the daytime, they never went anywhere near the hole. Believing the hole might be an opening to hell, the king ordered the pit to be sealed. Then, a structure was built surrounding the covering as a safeguard. The castle looks as if it had been built inside out. The outer walls have windows and consist of small stones. It was built using anything found close at hand, since it was miles to the nearest quarry. The inner walls look as if they have been designed to keep something in. All the big blocks line the inner court, and there are no windows. The chapel for the castle was built immediately above the pit. As you come across the castle, you'll see lots of windows. This is not something you want on the outer walls of a castle. An enemy would just climb in and take over. But as you get closer to the castle, you'll notice that some of these windows are fake. Inside the opening is a stone wall. Why go through the bother and expense of making windows and then brick them up on the inside? Everything used in construction had to be hauled to the site and then made by hand. Glass wasn't cheap back then, and yet a lot of it was used in these false windows. Dragons, a medieval symbol of evil, are being fought by St. Michael. Scenes of crucifixions are painted in stunning detail, and there's a beautiful portrait of St. Christopher all adorning the walls. But what's strangest is the painting of a left-handed, half-horse creature aiming a bow at a human. References to pagan mythology were not something found on church walls in this part of the country. The left hand was associated with service to Satan, which has led many researchers to believe the centaur is a hint at an evil creature which lurks beneath the church. The castle would still be impossible to defend unless the enemy was inside. In the lower chambers of the castle are paintings and artwork depicting saints and angels battling demons. There are religious symbols everywhere. The people were placed inside the castle to keep the place up and keep an eye on the pit. Late at night, they reported hearing sounds coming from the lower parts of the castle. They said it sounded like something was scratching on the rocks, trying to dig its way out. Sometimes they said they heard screaming coming through the floor of the castle. The castle was mostly ignored by the people living in the area. There were still stories of strange creatures that would be seen late at night, but it was nothing like what had been there before the castle was built. There's still things that shouldn't have been there. The castle seemed to be doing its job. Then the Nazis arrived in the neighborhood. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, was fascinated by the occult. He had sent out the Ahnenerbe to scour the world looking for powerful relics and books. When the Nazis found out about Huska Castle, they descended on it like rats. The Nazis hoped to unleash and then harness whatever evil lived deep down in the pit. The scientists and theologians were brought to the castle in order to study the place and find out what was held captive underneath it. For years, the Nazi scientists tried to harness the creatures of the pit. Were they successful? Think of all the evil things done by the Nazis during World War II. Millions of men, women, and children were murdered. Before abandoning the castle, the Nazis destroyed just about all of their records, so the Soviets couldn't get a hold of them. They did leave behind a mass of books used to try to understand what was under the castle. Many of these were Jewish books that supposedly had been burned when the libraries were cleaned out of anything not approved of by the rulers of Germany. They didn't want common men to read these books, but they used them for their own purposes. Years after World War II had come to an end, construction was being performed near the castle. As the workers dug down into the soil, they found bodies buried in unmarked graves. A forensics examination discovered these had been members of the Nazi Party that looked as if they had been ritualistically killed. The only idea I could come up with was, back in the 1940s, a group of German soldiers had been convinced to volunteer to die, so maybe whatever was under the castle could inhabit their bodies to serve the German army. If this sounds like something no one would do, you don't know the Nazis. They experimented on people to find out all manner of bizarre things. Did you see the movie The Keep? The plot goes, following the commencements of Operation Barbarossa, a unit of Wehrmacht under the command of Captain Klaus Warman occupies an uninhabited citadel in Romania in order to control the Dinju mountain pass. Two of the soldiers attempt to loot metallic icons within the keep, but accidentally unleash a spectral entity which kills them. The being known as Radu Molasar proceeds to kill several more soldiers in the following days, and then it begins to take corporal form. That means it becomes real. A detachment of Eisensalz commandos, under the command of sadistic SS Sturmbannführer Erich Kampfer, arrives to deal with what is thought to be partisan activity, and they begin executing villagers just because that's what they did. The movie was so badly edited it made little sense. I read the book written by F. Paul Wilson, so I knew what was going on. The film company had taken a 2.5-hour film and they chopped it down to an hour and a half, but they cut out too many of the important parts that told the story. The things would happen on the screen that you couldn't understand because the story was so chopped up. I must say the book was much better, only because you could understand what the heck was going on. Anyway, it seemed to me as if Wilson might have been thinking about Huska Castle when he wrote his story. A lot of the best stories are based on some actual events from the past. Today, mysterious phenomena can still be witnessed inside Huska Castle walls. In an effort to contain the demonic powers that hide below, the castle's chapel was built directly over the top of the bottomless pit, and many visitors have heard what they describe as choruses of screams coming from beneath the heavy floor. In the same area, numerous witnesses have described encountering a horrible creature that looks like a cross between a human and a frog, a very large frog. The caretakers of the building have witnessed a headless spirit that stumbles through the courtyard. This headless spirit has streams of blood gushing from his decapitated body. No one knows who this ghost was when it was walking the earth. None of the historic records tell of anyone having been decapitated in the castle, but then so many of the records were burned by the Nazis. The current owner of the building, Jaromir Semenok, claims to have watched his drinking glass levitate off of a table where he and his friends had gathered one evening, only for it to calmly lower itself and slide to the table's center. One of the most evil presences is regularly encountered in the hunting lodge. One evening, 2 guests were relaxing in the room when they heard a loud thump on the floor next to them. When the woman turned to see what had made the noise, she saw 2 featureless humanoid shadow figures approaching her. As these shadows began walking across the room, she could hear whispering coming from them. The shadows were saying something about having killed young girls. Once more, there's no record of children being killed in the castle, but think about the things the Nazis did in their death camps. Over the years, many paranormal television shows have visited Huska Castle. Just about everyone has come away saying the place is definitely haunted and possibly worse. If the castle is there to hold the gates to hell shut, is it not doing a good enough job? With that wonderful thought, I'm going to take a brief pause to drink some coffee. Don't go away, we'll be right back after these commercials. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. Did you go out UFO hunting and couldn't focus on the sky? Swing on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle Del Norte, right across from the Embassy Suites. That's not a weather balloon, that's a flying saucer. Coffee makes the world go round. And around here, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike, 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. If you're not looking for coffee, try their tea. It's the best in town. And remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee. This is Arkanasa Radio you've been listening to. And welcome back to the show. Like I've said on many occasions, for me to talk an entire hour without stopping, well, I wouldn't make it. So I take this little pause right in the middle to acknowledge some of the folks that helped me make this show a success and to drink some coffee. Because like I said before also, coffee makes the world go round. 3 mysterious giant craters appeared suddenly in northern Siberia, one of which was up to 300 feet deep. The scientists try to say that this was sinkholes. Had these holes been caused by meteorites, there would have been a seismic record of them somewhere. A sinkhole is a depression or a hole in the ground caused by some form of collapse or of the surface layer. Had these holes been caused by subsidence, there would have been someplace underground for all the dirt to go, like a giant cave or a tunnel. This sounds like a good explanation until you look closely at the holes. All around the openings are rocks and debris thrown there by some force coming up from below. What could have caused the dirt to explode out from underneath? The scientists quickly rushed out the theory that methane had been trapped below the surface. As it escaped, some unknown spark caused the methane to explode, sending rocks in every direction. These mystery holes aren't very deep, so they're not volcanoes. Until one of these holes pops open as people are there watching and they have the equipment to investigate, we might never know. The scary thing is, one of these holes could suddenly appear under a building during occupation. For example, June 2nd, 2010, a hole opened up in Guatemala City that swallowed a clothing factory. The hole was 66 feet across and plunged nearly 100 feet straight down. Geologists said that the circular-shaped hole suggested cave formation underneath, but what exactly caused the sinkhole was still a mystery. I can tell you what it is not. It's not a geological fault, and it's not a product of an earthquake, said David Monteros, a geophysics engineer at the National Disaster Management Agency. That's all we know. We're going to have to descend. The boys were lucky, resident Honora Oliva said. They left at 6 that afternoon, an hour before the earth opened up. Was it luck, or did God step in to keep these men alive? You decide for yourself. Next time we might not be so lucky. In space, the final frontier. Unless you consider the lack of knowledge and understanding we have when it comes to our own planet. 12 men have walked on the moon, but only 3 have been to the bottom of the ocean. 18 men have traveled 238,855 miles from our planet, but only 3 have gone 6.5 miles from the surface to the bottom. Why is it so much more interesting to go way far away to investigate space while there's a lot of unknown planet right here below our feet? To get to the moon, you need a launch vehicle like a Saturn rocket. Then you need a spacecraft to keep you alive while traveling through the vacuum of space. To travel to the bottom of the ocean, you need a submersible that can withstand 15,750 pounds per square inch. That's more than 1,000 the standard atmospheric pressure at sea level. Instead of traveling underwater, we could go by way of caves. There are so many out there, we only know of a few. The main problem here is you don't know where the cave will wind up until you follow it for as long as you can. Did you catch Josh Gates in the cave in South America? It looked dangerous and like a lot of hard work. And then 3 of them caught some horrible virus from eating food contaminated by bat poop. In the 1950s and 60s, while competing who could explore outer space the quickest, Americans and Soviets were also competing for who could explore deepest under the Earth's surface and do it the quickest. Both nations planned separate efforts to drill into the Earth's crust, each with the goal of drilling the deepest hole in the world. The American drilling project was called Project Mohole and was executed in the spring of 1961. The goal of the project was to drill into the Mohorovicic discontinuity, better known as the Mohole, which is the boundary between the Earth's crust and the mantle. The project wasn't so successful, though, because just 5 years later it was cut short due to a lack of funding. Not a lot of people wanted to spend tax dollars drilling a hole into the earth just to see where it would lead. This was going on back when I was in school. We all heard about it, and just about everybody was not interested. After all, we were going to the moon. To heck with drilling holes in the ground. The Soviets were a whole lot more driven to drill a deep hole just because they could. They always tried to one-up the United States. Right after the Boeing 747 came out, the Soviets came out with their giant plane that was just a few inches taller, just so they could have the biggest. The Soviets started their digging process 1970, right after we had beat them to the moon, and with the help of the Interdepartmental Scientific Council for the Study of the Earth's Interior and Super Deep Drilling, they were able to do a much more successful job of it and drill the deepest hole in the world. It is called the Kola Super Deep Bore Hole. They bored down 7.5 miles. They were able to make some groundbreaking, yes, that's a pun, discoveries. When you think about a drill going down into the surface of the earth, you think it goes straight down. Well, not really. As the drill passes through the rocks and dirt, it bends from side to side. Sometimes the drill might go at a 45-degree angle. The hard part is getting the thing to turn and travel down again. I spent just enough time in the oil field to know that I didn't like it. I did learn there was such a thing as a directional drill. The guys running the rig could force the drill to turn in various directions using technical things that I didn't understand, but they could do it. The Soviets were able to put geological theories to the test. One discovery made was that there isn't really a transition from granite to basalt between 2 and 4 miles beneath the surface as many scientists had originally thought. The basalt actually extended beyond the 8-mile mark. The scientists had to rethink their original theories about seismic reflection results. In other words, the Kola borehole led to the discovery that an entire layer of the Earth's crust doesn't actually exist. At around 4.3 miles down the hole, the drill hit water. Water was found in cracks and fissures. This was an amazing discovery because nobody expected water to exist at such great depths. It made researchers realize that the water inside the cracks were probably caused by hydrogen and oxygen atoms squeezed out and then retained below the surface because the impermeable rock above. After this discovery of water within the hole, the people started to believe that the hole was associated with the story of Noah's flood. It was hypothesized that after the massive flood, all the water drained into the subterranean sinkholes. The scientists used to say it was impossible for the earth to have been covered in water because there wasn't enough of it to begin with, and then where did it all go? Some folks that heard about the water existing underground began to say this was where all the water from the flood had gone. Finally, one of the most amazing discoveries made through the project was the detection of life in the form of microscopic fossils found in rocks that were more than 2 billion years old. From the fossils, researchers were able to find the remains of 25 different species of plankton. In 1994, the Kola Super Deep Bore Hole project came to an end. One reason given was that it was just getting way too hot down there. The temperatures near the bottom of the hole was reported to be 356 degrees. At this temperature, food and people get cooked. Now, I bake bread at 350 degrees. This was such a huge difference from the expected 212 degrees that it was almost unbearable for the drill bit to continue further. Not only that, but the rock density increased the deeper the hole was dug, resulting in greater porosity and permeability. In other words, it was like drilling through plastic rather than solid, which made it very difficult to operate. Drill bits would be worn out, necessitating pulling all the drill pipe out of the hole to switch out the bit. That would be 1,320 individual drill pipe. Each pipe is 30 feet long, for those of you that were never in the oil field. At the very bottom of the hole, the final temperature reading was 2,000 degrees. Not only were people saying that the hole was proving Noah's flood by showing where all the water went, they began saying they might have drilled into hell. A bunch of scientific instruments were lowered into the hole to determine how hot it was and what kind of rocks were down there. One instrument was a microphone to listen for sounds of tectonic crust movement. As they listened to what they hoped would be rocks grinding together, instead they heard what sounded like people screaming. They used a filter to drown out background noise, and then they could hear thousands of voices all crying out in pain. Dr. Azakov, one of the scientists running the project, said, "The last discovery was nevertheless the most shocking to our ears, so much so that the scientists are afraid to continue the project. We tried to listen to the Earth's movements at certain intervals with supersensitive microphones, which were let down through the hole. What we heard turned those logically thinking scientists into a trembling ruin. It was a sometimes a week, high-pitched sound which we thought to be coming from our own equipment." Dr. Azakov added, "After some adjustments, we comprehended that indeed the sound came from the Earth's interior. We could hardly believe our own ears. We heard a voice screaming in pain. Even though one voice was discernible, we could hear thousands, perhaps millions in the background, of suffering souls screaming." After this ghastly discovery, about half the scientists quit out of fear. Hopefully that which is down there will stay there. What really unnerved the Soviets, apart from the voice recordings, was the appearance that same night of a fountainhead of luminous gas shooting up from the drill site, and out of the midst of this incandescent cloudy pillar, a brilliant being with bat wings revealed itself with the words, "I have conquered," emblazoned across the dark Siberian sky in Russia. Naturally, the official government reason for stopping the project was too much money with not enough results. The government tells us the truth, right? Especially in Russia. The drilling was stopped. The pipe was all pulled from the ground. Then the opening was sealed shut to keep anybody from falling in, or to keep anything from getting out. They were only able to drill 0.002% of the way to the center of the Earth. Jacques Cousteau, the world-famous underwater explorer, quit deep-sea diving years before he died. It is said that he stopped because during one of his dives into an underwater cave, he had heard the sound of people screaming. He tried to write this off as being just pressure on his eardrums and some unknown anomaly. In the long run, he stopped his deep-sea exploration. On another occasion, one of his men was in a diving bell in the deepest trench in the Bermuda Triangle. As the diver was doing scientific stuff, he began hearing sounds coming through the sides of the bell. He signaled to be brought up immediately. After recovering from shock, the diver told the others of his frightening experience of hearing screams of people in pain. This sounds so much like what the Russians found at the bottom of the Kola Super Deep Hole. Is hell a real place? I don't want to find out. Blue holes are steep, roughly circular underwater caves or sinkholes, which are also referred to as vertical caves, and can be descended down to a depth of 1,286 feet. Blue holes are so named for the dramatic contrast between the dark blue of their depths and the lighter colored shallows surrounding them, although inland blue holes tend to look more like circular black lakes due to mostly rotting vegetation. There are around 50 of these blue holes scattered throughout the shallow areas around the Andros Islands in the Bahamas. Every time I say Bahamas, I think of that song by Joe Scruggs, "In the Bahamas in My Pajamas." My wife is a school teacher. One year Joe Scruggs came to Laredo for a performance. We looked kind of odd being the only adults there without any kids, but we enjoyed the show. Many of these blue holes branch off into intricate submerged passages and extensive underwater cave systems that can meander in all directions for thousands of feet. Some of these holes connect to other holes in a huge underwater community. The blue holes of the Bahamas have always held a sense of awe and mystery. Although popular places to dive, it is believed that less than 1% of the blue hole cave system of the Bahamas has ever been explored. And it's only been within the last several decades that we have really uncovered any good information on what the holes even are. The people of the area have long spoken of an enormous monster said to inhabit the blue holes of the island. The creature is known as a luska. The luska is said to be a gigantic animal that can reach the size of 75 feet in length, and it resembles something like a cross between an octopus and a shark. It has a mass of tentacles and a mouth full of long, sharp teeth. It is said that the creature lives deep in the blue holes, caves, during the day, and it comes out of its lair to hunt at night. Witnesses report that the luska will suddenly rise up under an unsuspecting swimmer and simply suck them beneath the water with shocking speed, leaving nothing but bubbly water behind. Since the monster purportedly drags the hapless prey into craggy underwater caves to feed, the bodies of these victims are never seen again. The luska is commonly blamed for missing swimmers and the occasional disappearance of cave divers in the area as well. Locals insist that the luska will target not only swimmers and divers, but boats as well. It is said that the luska will snatch people off the decks of boats, and some accounts even speak of whole boats being pulled under, leaving only swirling debris bobbing in the surface. Various disappearances of boats over the years have been deemed to be the work of the luska. The creature is said to be so dangerous that will occasionally even come up and grab victims right off the beaches. Fishermen around the area are extremely wary when passing by blue holes. Sound is supposed to attract the creatures, so as the fishermen pass by, they remain as quiet as they can. In 2005, an underwater photographer reported being attacked by an enormous octopus he described as being about 50 feet long. The terrified diver shoved his camera in front of his body, trying to protect himself. The monstrous octopus snatched the camera away from his grasp before disappearing into a cave. Another man was swimming near a blue hole around sundown when he was violently yanked underwater. The swimmer managed to pull himself away and get to the nearby shore. Once he had drug himself ashore, the swimmer discovered huge sucker marks on one of his thighs. Another somewhat frightening encounter occurred when when a crew of divers went looking for the creature in an attempt to capture it. The crew dropped cages over the side like the men on Deadliest Catch. The traps were all attached to the boat with sturdy rope. At first, the crew of the boat noticed something large and heavy was pulling on the traps and breaking the lines. Things got scarier when one of the traps was pulled away, but the line securing it to the boat held. The boat was dragged along by whatever was at the other end of the line at the speed of about a knot. Onboard sonar revealed what was described as a very large, pyramid-shaped creature. After the boat was dragged some distance, the line suddenly went slack. Thinking the line was broken, the crew hauled the rope back in. The line hadn't snapped, and the crew pulled the cage back over the side of the boat. The heavy steel structure of the cage had been twisted into a crumpled mess. This brought the fishing for monsters to an end as the crew made mad full-speed dash back for port. Josh Gates and Destination Truth went to the Bahamas to investigate the blue holes. They wanted to find out what, if anything, might be living deep inside these holes. Diving to a depth of 150 feet into the blue hole, the team came across a huge opening in the wall. As the divers were looking at the opening, the boat crew were startled by sonar contact with something huge in the water with the divers. Josh Gates simultaneously spotted something moving, something enormous, which he at first had taken to be merely a part of the wall. Although the creature wasn't clearly sighted, the incident was spooky enough for them to pull Gates from the water. I watch Josh Gates all the time. He's got, 3 TV shows going now? I often wonder, how does he get access to all these places that he goes? He got to meet and talk to the high priest at the church in Axum, Ethiopia, where the Ark of the Covenant is said to be. He spent the night in King Tut's tomb. His crew got to investigate the fort ruins at Masada. Either he has the best luck on the planet, or his production crew is spending the entire budget on handouts. Undeterred, Gates decided to make another dive in a different spot, this time going down 175 feet into an underwater cavern. Again, the crew got sonar readings of something large moving through the water, and once again, Gates saw movement in the murk ahead of him, along with ripples and bubbles. In addition, FLIR cameras picked up movement from something very big lurking nearby. The situation was frightening enough to convince the crew to turn off the lights on their boat in fear that they might attract whatever was down there. Although there was no concrete evidence obtained during the expedition, the team was able to analyze footage they had taken, and they noticed something that looked rather like a large tentacle. It was speculated what was captured on film was perhaps part of some sort of an enormous octopus or squid. I guess I've used up all my adventurous spirit. As a firefighter and a border patrol agent, I've had enough fun. I tell my wife I want my adventures either on pages of a book or on the TV. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. Tell others to listen in if you did. Oh, heck, tell them even if you didn't enjoy it. Maybe they will. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murdered 3? Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.